We're going to change focus now and talk about surrogacy. It can be a somewhat sophisticated technology if there's a situation where there's both donor sperm and egg that is fertilized and then implanted in the surrogate mother's womb, and very expensive when it is done that way. And if you're not exactly sure what I'm referring to when I mention surrogacy, it's when a female gestates the baby, in other words, carries it to term, and then agrees to allow another couple to have the child. The genetic material is donated. In many cases, the egg and sperm are harvested out of the other couple, fertilized in a laboratory, and then implanted in the mother. This is called gestational surrogacy, and in these cases, the baby is not at all related to the surrogate mother. In traditional surrogacy, the surrogate mother is impregnated with the man's sperm, and thus the baby has some of her genetic material. So surrogates usually get about $10,000 to $20,000 plus a stipend for clothing and food to assure that they get adequate nutrition. If the donor couple has invested their money and the time to harvest all the genetic material as well, and has drawn up a contract that all parties have signed and has paid the surrogate mother for the incubation period, then what would happen if the mother decided she does not want to allow the donor couple to have the child that's born? This, of course, now makes us examine what the nature of the relationship is. Exactly what kind of social arrangement do we have here? Is this a family that's being created? Or is it just a contract that people are entering into? Remember the Heck case, and the decision by the courts was that the frozen sperm was not merely property. So perhaps we should think in terms of surrogacy not just being a contract. When life is being created, there might be something more than just property or other legal rights to consider. The first surrogacy case, where there was a dispute, at least according to the Reproductive Rights Reporter, where I got most of these cases from, is that of the case of Denise Thrain. She entered into a contract with the Noyces, and this was back in the 1970s. Thrain backed out even before the baby was born. She felt a bond with the baby, and she knew she could not give it up. The Noyces did consider suing, but they were advised against it when they sought legal help. Reason being, Mrs. Noyce had formerly been a man. She had had sexual reassignment, and the legal counsel felt the court would not be willing to grant legal custody to a couple that were not fully a traditional couple in the sense of being a male and female couple. This was decades ago, and transgenderism was far less likely to be accepted then than it is today, so the Noyces backed away from legal action. Now we get to the story of the Malahoffs and Judy Stiver. Mr. and Mrs. Malahoff entered into a contract with Judy Stiver, who was then at the time married, for $10,000, and that was the general price for a surrogate at that time. Doctors certified that Judy Stiver was not pregnant after examining her, and they inseminated her with Mr. Malahoff's semen. The baby was born with microcephaly, which is a brain condition that leads to damage. The umbilical cord of that baby had had several knots in it just prior to being born. And the baby also had a life-threatening infection which needed to be treated or the baby would die. Mr. Malahoff had signed the birth certificate recognizing him as the father when the baby was born, but when the physicians approached him about treatment for the infection, he refused to grant it. Mrs. Stiver claimed that Mr. Malahoff said, "Let the baby die, and we can try again," though Mr. Malahoff would deny he said that later. Malahoff then decided to assert that the baby was not his, so he questioned its paternity. In the time-honored tradition of airing personal problems to the entire nation, Mr. Malahoff and the Stivers went on the Phil Donahue show, and the paternity tests were told to all three while the show was being taped. It turned out that Mr. Malahoff was not the father. By this time, the Malahoffs were divorced, and Judy and Ray Stiver stated they were willing to raise the child. Just so you know, the doctors did not advise Miss Stiver not to have sex with her husband for several weeks after she was inseminated, and that is how she became pregnant by her husband. In thinking about this type of situation, the one with the Malahoffs and the Stivers, of who exactly is the parent when these things happen, it's worth understanding the history of adoption proceedings in this country. Babies cannot be treated as a commodity, just like genetic material. They're more than just things that adults have rights to. In the 1950s, Congress passed laws against baby selling because it was not uncommon for prostitutes to get pregnant and then try to profit from the placement of their babies. Or so Congress said this was their main concern. Lawyers also profited enormously in these adoption proceedings. Childless couples longing for a baby would pay very high fees, and the mothers and the lawyers would make large sums of money. So there were federal laws that were passed to limit the amount of money that can pass hands in an adoption. Some things just cannot be sold, such as organs. You can donate your organs, but you cannot sell them. So now ponder the idea of genetic material being something other than just property. Does that imply perhaps that the uterus, as an incubator of life, is something that then can be rented out? We know we cannot sell body parts, and we know that genetic material is more than just property. Perhaps some things should not be for rent. I'm not saying I take that position, just something to think about. Now we get to the Baby M case. This is a big one which makes the front page of every newspaper in the country when it unfolds. Mary Beth Whitehead entered into a contract with the Sterns. Mrs. Stern had multiple sclerosis, and pregnancy could potentially cause paralysis. The Sterns were a professional couple. At the hospital, Mary Beth Whitehead said she was bonded to the baby and could not part with it. The Sterns allowed her to keep the baby for a short period and then took the baby home. Within 24 hours, Mary Beth Whitehead was at their doorstep begging to see the baby again. The Sterns allowed her to take the baby for a short visitation, and Mary Beth Whitehead ran to Florida with the infant. This was to be the first surrogacy case that would go to court. The trial court validated the surrogacy contract, and the baby was awarded to the Sterns. The trial decision was appealed, but the New Jersey Supreme Court upheld the validity of the surrogacy contract, and the Sterns remained the child's parents. So now we have to decide how surrogacy contracts should be decided. Is it just a matter of interpretation of the contract? That means we would just look at what's known as the four corners or the black letter of the law? Or do we look at the four corners, the document itself, and the additional contribution of the father's genetic material? Or do we look at the mother as simply an incubator? And there's no consistency between the states. There are 3 different positions that can be taken, and each state can determine how they will deal with it. And then that begs the question, what state decides if, say, the pregnancy occurs in one state, the contract might be entered into in another state, and then if the mother runs, the baby could be born in a third state. The decision-making in these cases can become very complex, and there can be some uncertainty built into the process. So another real situation is the 1994 McDonald versus McDonald suit. This is a situation where a mother had an in vitro fertilized egg implanted in her. The genetic material came from her husband, but the egg was actually a donor egg from another woman. This was a situation where Mrs. McDonald could gestate the child, but she was not producing viable eggs, so she had an egg donation. Then Mr. and Mrs. McDonald divorce, and Mr. McDonald sues for custody of the child, saying he's the only genetic link, and that Mrs. McDonald had no genetic ties to the child. What should the court do now? The outcome is that the court decided that this was not a surrogacy case, but instead it was an egg donation case. And And, since the mother had raised the child since birth, she had been the primary caretaker of the child, and then she should retain custody of the child when the couple split. And there are even thornier issues arising now. The morality of cloning is in question. It's illegal to clone human beings in the United States, but not all countries have the same limitations. Cloning also raises some serious moral and ethical issues. And we also know from cloning animals that the DNA is usually compromised, and that the clone generally does not live an entirely healthy life and usually has a limited lifespan that is less than the original had. Stem cell research is also called into question, and the use of fertility drugs and the frequency of multiple births and the dangers to the infants that multiple births pose raises serious moral issues for the potential parents, as well as for the medical community that's supporting these types of efforts. The bottom line is this central theme that I want to impress upon you, that new technologies bring new opportunities for doing things, and we don't have the norms nor the policies to be able to predict what to do when unexpected outcomes occur. One way of trying to determine what the policy should be is to stay focused on a central question, and that is, what is best, and what kind of society are we trying to foster?